Good evening. A very warm welcome to you. It's good to see you. For those that don't know me, my name is Martin. I'm the Bishop of Leicester and co-hosting this evening along with Nishan as Vice-Chancellor of Leicester University. So thank you for coming to be with us this evening. Really pleased that you've chosen to spend this time here with us for what is a sort of reinvention, if you like, of a tradition that we've had of university lectures sponsored by the church locally. We're sort of reinventing largely because it's now across all three universities in the area, so Leicester, De Montfort and Loughborough University as well. So we are going to be working on a pattern of having a lecture each term in one of the three. So last term it was De Montfort University. We were very privileged to have the Bishop of London addressing that. And then next term, into the autumn, we will be at Loughborough University as well. I'll say more about that perhaps at the end, so you can get that date as well. I'm going to be handing over in a moment to Luke, who is the chaplain here, the lead chaplain at Leicester University, who is a personal friend of our speaker this evening, Sam. So he's going to do the introduction before the talk. But I just wanted to say that I'm particularly pleased that we're able to do this in partnership with the Message Trust as well, because the subject that you've seen for this evening is around poverty. And that has become a particular theme for me in my own work, particularly in the House of Lords. So I, within the Church of England, carry a particular brief now around child poverty. And you may well know that Leicester has one of the highest rates of child poverty of any city in the country. I don't know if you did know that or not, but that's the fact. The reason for that, I'm sure, there are multiple reasons, and that's something we can unpack further if you would like to in questions and so on later. But this is a topic of very particular local relevance to us here in Leicester. And even in chatting with Sam just beforehand, we were both saying, actually, yes, slightly surprised that the Message doesn't have a hub, actually, in Leicester. They are in many cities all around the country. We'll hear more about that, no doubt, in a moment or two, but not here in Leicester. So I think there's going to be some follow-up conversations from this evening already. But thank you, as I say, for being here. After Sam has spoken, there will be a time for some questions. I'll facilitate that in a moment or two. So please do be thinking as you're going through as to what questions you'd like to ask, and we'll try and develop a real conversation through all of that. But let me hand over to Luke, as I say, who's going to introduce our speaker to us.
Yeah, the Message doesn't have a hub in Leicester yet. Maybe some of that journey starts this evening even. So my name's Luke, as Martin said. I'm the Anglican and coordinating chaplain, and just a quick word about the chaplaincy. Some of you will know we're an ecumenical partnership between a number of church denominations, and we are actually a charity slightly separate to and yet embedded within this university that we feel we're called to serve. We aim to be a place of welcome for students and staff of all faiths and none, and as an expression of our Christian faith as Christian chaplains. And so from week to week, our building is filled with all sorts of different people, lots of international students, postgrad students, staff and undergraduates. And we seek to be, as well as that, sort of a prophetic voice, a house of prayer, a place where some people can just belong, and others, if they want to, can go on a journey of exploring those big questions of life and those basics of faith. It's a real joy and a privilege to be able to welcome Sam here. Sam is, as you can see on the screen, CEO of the Message Trust, and he'll say more about what the Message do, primarily in Manchester, but now actually all over the country and the world. I think most people probably invite Sam because of his job title and other credentials, and that's all well and good because he does some great things in his job, and he's an excellent speaker. But we invited him because, as Bishop Martin alluded to, I've known Sam for a long time, and I know of his integrity, and I know that he's a good guy and who walks the walk as well as talking the talk. So when I first met Sam, I was an 18-year-old gap year student and he was a volunteer youth worker on one of the estates where the Message work. And I was on one placement a week with Sam. Somehow we've stayed in touch, and while Sam's calling and career has taken him into church leadership and then to leading the organisation, he actually still lives on that estate and still is involved in that local community. And you'll hear some stories from real life on the ground in the community, and it's that as much as anything that made us want to invite Sam. So it's great to have you here. Would you please welcome Sam as he comes to speak?
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Bishop. It's wonderful to be with you and to be able to share my thoughts, which you can critique and question at the end, which doesn't in any way unnerve me whatsoever. Sorry, you're going to have to look at 3 of me tonight. That's quite imposing, particularly with my forehead, the size that it is. 24 years ago, I relocated from the suburbs of Manchester into the inner city, following the ways of Jesus in what we would call the downward mobility, the kenosis of Christ, who empties himself and chooses the way of poverty. I felt inspired by him, and so I joined a project called Eden. Eden was seeing young Christians relocate into areas of deprivation to live, serve, work, in order to see communities change and see the kingdom grow. And I think that was really where it all began for me. I moved into a 2-up, 2-down terraced house next to an Irish alcoholic that I could hear. He used to get noisier as the day went on, as his drinking increased. I could hear him more and more, became more confident, more violent. And his young daughter, that at times I would hear such distressing things as to what went on in that house, and I was desperate to see change there. That was Tommy. To my right, to my left was Karen. Karen and her mother and her daughter were all sex workers who worked from home. And that was quite an eye-opener, moving into a community like that, very tight, narrow terrace streets, and being exposed very quickly to deprivation. This area was blighted by deprivation. It's interesting to hear about child poverty statistics for Leicester. At one point, I think it might have been 2007, 2008, I was approached by the BBC, who had done studies on child poverty, and found that my area had 96% of children considered living in poverty. Just my area alone, not all of Manchester, so Leicester's figures are quite staggering. But that was the sort of the reality of life, moving into this very, very broken neighbourhood. High levels of deprivation, poor education, poor healthcare, poor housing. Imagine the housing stock. 50% of the housing stock in my neighbourhood was boarded up. When we wanted to move in as a team to see if we could bring transformation to the community, we spoke to the local housing association, who effectively said, how many houses would you like? You can help yourself. And so my team of about 20 all moved in very, very close proximity to one another into these narrow houses. It's not like that anymore. Some of our most disadvantaged communities are our most densely populated. Empty houses, apart from those owned by the council, are very hard to find these days. It wasn't long after I moved in that my housemate wanted to take advantage of the very cheap housing. We'd been offered a 3-bed terraced house for £9,000 in the early 2000s and wanted to take full advantage of that. And so he put an offer in on this house. He didn't get it, actually, but we ended up in a 2-bed house, which was even cheaper. It wasn't long after I got a phone call from work. By the way, I'm working at this point in the city as an accountant. Please don't go to sleep at that point. And I was using my time in the evenings to really serve the community. I did loads of youth work, which is where I met Luke. And I got a phone call from my housemate saying, you need to come home because our house has been burgled. And so I drove home as fast as was legally possible and arrived at the same time as a policeman. And we walked in the house together, and he was shocked, really, because the house had been emptied. Emptied of everything that could have been carried by one person. The sofa was still there, and the washing machine was still neatly tucked under the kitchen side. But pretty much everything else had been removed from our house. And the policeman said, wow, you've been done. And I said, well, what do you do when you've been done? And he said, well, why don't you go and knock on a few neighbours' houses? This is a tight neighbourhood. With narrow streets and thin walls, somebody will have heard or seen something. well, they're not going to talk to a policeman, are they, in a neighbourhood like mine? But they were willing possibly to talk to me. So I went next door to our neighbour, Paul, knocked on his front door, and it was ajar. And I thought, oh no, they've stolen from us, and then they've broken into Paul's house. Maybe they've been making their way up the street, doing one house after another while we're all out. So we pushed our way inside Paul's house and found all our belongings neatly stacked in the front room. That's awkward. The policeman said, wow, you've been done by your neighbour. And I said, well, what do you do when you've been done by your neighbour? He said, oh, I'm clueless. I said, well, why don't you hide behind the sofa? And when Paul comes back, you can pop out and catch him red-handed. And he said, well, that's not modern-day policing, so we won't be doing that. So he helped me carry everything back, because that is modern-day policing. Everything was carried back into the house. And, well, it's a good job that he didn't wait around, because it was like 2 or 3 weeks before Paul showed his face. In fact, he didn't really show his face. Me and my housemate were in the backyard, and we heard Paul. And so we shouted over the wall, Paul, are you there? And very sheepishly, he sort of said, yeah, and then poked his head over the wall. And he said, oh, lads, I've heard you've had a very difficult time. And we said, well, yes, Paul, we were burgled. He said, I don't know how that happened. And I said, I've got some ideas about how that happened, Paul, because all our belongings were found in your house. He said, oh, I am so sorry. I really don't know how that happened. How can I make it up to you? And so we said, well, look, Paul, why don't you come round for tea? And why don't we talk about it? Why don't we try and work out what may have happened for all that stuff to land up in your house? And he wasn't so sure he wanted to come, but we said, please come, we'll put some food on. And I remember him coming in real sheepish, like it may be a trap. You know, in a neighbourhood like ours, there's a rule where you don't poo on your doorstep would be, well, I've slightly made that an easier statement, but you don't mess up in your own neighbourhood, because you've got to live next door to the trouble you create. And so he was really nervous that maybe we had set him up to sort of sort him out in some way or another. But he came into the smell of bolognese cooking in the kitchen, and he came and sat at the table, which he found utterly bizarre, that we would eat at the table together with cutlery laid out all ready for him. And so we began to talk about what was going on, and we learned a bit more about his life. We learned about the things that he was experiencing, the addiction that had taken root in his life, and the state of really his existence, and how very, very difficult that was. Paul was desperate to make amends. We said, look, we just want you to know you're forgiven. We move on. And what can we do to help you as you move on in life? And he was like, no, it's not what you can do for me. It's what I can do for you. I've got to make up for this. I've got to make up for this. We said, look, Paul, there is nothing that we need. And he said, how about I be your gardener? Well, that's a nice idea, Paul, but we don't have a garden. We live in a terraced house, which is identical to yours, and it has a yard, concrete yard. He was like, no, your front garden. Paul, as you know, we don't have a front garden. We have this tiny strip of concrete about 1 metre deep before the wall. But what was existing between the concrete and the wall was this patch of mud in which I believed grew weeds. And it's those weeds that Paul wanted to make his own. I'll be your gardener, Paul said. And so Paul used to be our gardener. He would tend to the weeds, and he would remove the litter that would get caught in it from time to time. And then one spring, the weeds blossomed and bloomed. I don't know what the technical term is, but these weeds were actually beautiful roses, and it was his pride and joy. It was this moment of real celebration. This is what I've done for you. This was his way of repaying, and it was this sign of the kingdom amidst the brokenness and the pain and the mess grew this thing of beauty, this rose bush. But Paul's life epitomized for me what poverty looks like. It was so far from what you'd think was God's intention for him. It was a life blighted by drug addiction and alcoholism. He was jobless, virtually unemployable, penniless through all of the time that we knew him. His family had abandoned him. His health was terrible. He was waiting for a liver transplant, which meant he had to regularly go into hospital to have transfusions take place. The health service had no idea what to do with Paul. The drug service had no idea what to do with Paul. They'd stick him on a methadone script, and he'd take his methadone, and then he'd buy more heroin to top up his addiction. And so he was always in this sort of weird situation of adding to his addiction. His addictions weren't decreasing with the help of the drug service. They were, in fact, increasing. The government wanted to constantly take his benefits off him. If he didn't show up to an appointment and at the exact time in the right place, they threatened him with taking his benefits from him, that put his housing at risk, that put him at the threat of homelessness. And this cycle of deprivation is ever increasingly more complex. The police had given up on him. When they found out who it was that had stolen from us, they were like, what can we do? Like a prison sentence isn't going to help this guy. He'll come out, begin to take drugs again, and the cycle of deprivation will continue. For me, Paul epitomized the poverty that existed around me. I have so many stories of people, families, brokenness that I found myself within, that I've been desperate to do something about. How do we make a difference? How do we see poverty begin to change? Is there a way for us to begin to see poverty alleviated? What do we do about child hunger, child poverty? It's deeply concerning. Is there an answer? I'm going to propose to you today that there might be. For me, the answer to poverty is not prosperity. It's not the distribution of wealth. The answer, the opposite of poverty, is not greater affluence, it is community. The opposite of poverty is true community. Why is it that drug addicts huddle together in one place? I found myself in the front room of an addict when there was a drug shortage in my neighborhood, and around the room is one after another of addicts all huddled together. They are not good friends. They are dependent upon each other in order to survive. Why is it that young men join gangs? Why is it that people from chaotic backgrounds and broken lives find themselves in the same friendship groups? It's because they're looking for and dependent upon community in order to survive. There is biblical precedent for this. When we look at the very first book of the Bible, when we look at the story of creation, we're told that God, after each and every day, says that what he has made is good. The first thing that we are told in the scriptures that is not good is man's aloneness, man's isolation, man's loneliness, man's lack of community. Genesis 2:18, the Lord God said, "It's not good for man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." Why is that? Well, mankind, according to the Christian tradition, is made from the mud, but made in the image of God. Genesis 1:27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. This is what we call the Imago Dei, divine likeness. And Christians get all in a tangle about what is the nature of true Imago Dei, what attributes make up divine likeness. I would say this: the first attribute of the Imago Dei is oneness, union, and need for community. We are not designed to be alone. Think about society and its brokenness, how the increase in loneliness exists. This is not how we were designed. We were designed for union and unity, designed for communion and community, because we are made in the image of God, who is by very nature in community. We call it the Trinity: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They are one. And they exist together. They'll be together forever. They are inseparable. And this is how we are made, in the image of that God, in the image of a God in community, made to be together with others, made to be inseparable. We do not work on our own. But this is a completely counter narrative to that which we are hearing in society at the moment. We're told that in some ways it's good to be alone because we're told that independence is a sign of importance. That self-sufficiency is the sign of success. That autonomy is profoundly awesome. We're told that we're not better together, that we really need to focus on taking care of number one. Place no consideration for number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. And it's anti our design because it's anti-God, and therefore it's anti-kingdom. We're told in Scripture that God places the lonely in families. Why? It's because families are the unit, the design of God for which we are found in community. We are made for relationships. One of the most profound passages I find is in John 19. John 19, we find Christ nailed upon a cross, limited in words. He looks down from the cross and sees his mother and his friend. When Jesus saw his mother there, it says, and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that time on, the disciple took her into his home. This is Jesus dying when with his final breath, he's trying to unite the family. He's trying to create community because he knows he can't be a son to his mother and he knows he can't be a friend to his friend. And therefore he reconciles them together and says, you're going to need each other. This is the unit for surviving. This is the unit for thriving. We are made to be together. What concerns me is, those decision makers, the policy makers in our nation seem to be relationally distanced from those they're trying to help. We have a proximity problem in the UK. If we really and truly want to know how to meet and minister to the needs of the hurting and the broken, we need to be in relationship with them. But yet we have an increasing gap between policymakers and those who are supposed to benefit from the policies. It's a real concern. We find it with politicians who have no understanding of the neighbourhoods in which they serve. We see it within the NHS, something we call the inverse care law, that the richest get healthier and the poorer get sicker. That's why you can get this differential between East and West in Glasgow, 20 years on life expectancy. The inverse care law is a tragedy. And it's the same, sadly, in the church. The resources of the church are found in the most affluent of places. Church decline is happening fastest in the poorest areas. Churches are closing. I heard recently from Bishop Philip North, who talked about 850 parishes that are seen as urban priority areas that are without a minister because the resources end up in the places of most affluence. We need to know those we're serving. We are called into proximity, called into relationship, called into community with those that we are supposed to serve. We all need community. We all need genuine friendship. We all need beautiful relationships. I don't know about you, but I need people that will comfort me, challenge me, teach me, advocate for me, cherish and support me, affirm me, forgive me, challenge me, celebrate me, understand me. We all need people around us that distinctively know us. One of my best friends is a guy called Steve. Steve and I became friends because, actually, very sadly, through tragedy. His son was on the way to my youth club and was hit by a car in a hit and run accident. He survived that, but I had to go and knock on the door of this young man's house and meet his father. His father was a notorious drug dealer from my neighborhood with a reputation for violence. And I had to go and say, hello, sorry, but your son's been run over when he was coming to my youth club. That's an awkward and difficult situation. But Steve and I became very good friends. To this day, I would consider him one of my closest. I call him my wingman. Often when I go and speak in churches, Steve will come. I remember we were traveling to the northeast one time because we were seeing another sort of project initiated and started. We got McDonald's on the way, which is the tradition. And when we arrived, I had to sit on the front row because that's where the speakers sit. And Steve always sits next to me. But he said, "Oh, Sam, I just need to have a cigarette before the service starts." And I said, "That's fine, Steve. But you need to know, as soon as you hear music, you need to be back in the front seat with me." And so we popped outside for a cheeky cig. And then the music started. And there's no sign of Steve. And we did, the Christian thing. There was an introduction, and then there was a song, and still no sign of Steve. Second song, no sign of Steve. I'm thinking, I'm on after the third song. And am I going to have to leave now to try and locate him? What am I going to do? They're waiting for me to deliver the talk, and there's no sign of Steve. Well, third song's just coming into land, and then in rushes Steve and stands next to me. And I'm trying to hold it all together. And I say, "Steve, where have you been?" And Steve says, "I went to get you these," and unfurled his hand, and in his hand were 5 penny sweets. And he whispered in my ear, "I know you get a little bit nervous before you speak. So I thought you might like these. Thought sugar might take the edge off." I'm like, "Could you not get a bag?" 5 penny sweets. He said he'd gone out to try and find a shop, and he had 1 5-pence coin left in his pocket. This is a guy battling heroin addiction. This is a guy who, for every penny counts. And he'd gone out to try and locate a shop to spend his last 5p on the guy he'd come to do ministry with. And here he is. And you know what? I was overwhelmed. I took the 5 penny sweets, and they're like, "Please welcome Sam Ward." And I'm shoving 5 penny sweets into my mouth. But my mouth is full and my heart is full, and I'm almost fighting the tears. Why? Because I've got someone who knows me and loves me. I've got a friend that you might not think he's desirable. He's got long, straggly hair like the guy out of Shameless. He's got 1 single tooth left that he calls his toothpick. But he's my mate, and he knows me, and he loves me. I absolutely love that. I think it was Archbishop Desmond Tutu who wrote this when talking about the African concept of Ubuntu. He says this: "The essence of being human is that a person is a person only through other persons. That my humanity is caught up in yours. I am fully me only if you are all you can be. In a sense, I only exist. My true existence is by very nature in relationship. I need relationships. You need relationships. We are made for this." Let me draw your attention to what the Apostle Paul writes to the church in Rome. He says this in Romans chapter 12. "Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Don't be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited." That's quite a set of commands, but he writes to a church saying, if you want to know what it looks like to be a community, if you want to know what the kingdom of God truly looks like, then it looks like these things: sincere love, a devotion to others, honoring, a culture of hospitality and sharing, blessing and not cursing, relationships where you rejoice when people succeed, where you mourn when they mourn, and living in harmony. What an incredible set of values. What would that look like if the church in the UK genuinely epitomized these values? Where a community where not just some serve, but all serve, where our weaknesses are known and our successes are shared. Jesus said this in John 13:35, "By this, everybody will know that you're my disciples. They'll know you're mine if you love one another. People will see that we belong to something if we love properly. Our community is shaped around love, where honor and celebration of others is right at the very heart. These communities are deeply attractive. These communities look and make Jesus look more attractive. Have you ever heard someone say, I just couldn't go to that church because they love each other so much? Is that the reputation of the church in the UK? They are so incredibly loving. I am deeply off-put. I wish that was the headline. Sadly, we are far from it. I invited a guy a few years ago to watch the Champions League final at my house. A guy I was getting to know, a guy I was trying to bring into the community a little bit. And I said, oh, why don't you come and watch the Champions League at my house? Got a few mates round. And he came into the house and we sort of began to have food and drink. And he just went straight to the corner of the room and parked himself and then didn't move. Like, I said, do you want a drink? No. Do you want any food? No. And it was kind of awkward, you know. And the football began and he just didn't speak, didn't cheer, didn't give any other commentary to what was going on. I thought, oh no, I wonder if he's one of those people. You know when you're watching a film and there's someone who all the time tells you what they think's going to happen next. And so they get really frustrated. Maybe he's that guy with football. You invited me to watch the football. You didn't invite me into this madness. At the end of 90 minutes, my mate got up and as soon as the whistle went, almost, he was like on his feet. Right, I better go. And I said, oh, well, do you mind if I walk home with you? Because I'm kind of romantic like that. And he said, sure, if you want. You know, it was kind of awkward. And so we began walking up the street towards his house. And I said, is everything okay? Is everything all right? You didn't seem like you liked it tonight. And he said to me, Sam, I've had the best night ever. He said, I came into your house and then I felt something I don't think I've ever felt before. I was like, could you articulate? What were the feelings? And I'm expecting him to give me a whole list of Christianese, love and joy and peace. He's like, oh, I just felt amazing. He said, I felt so amazing that I didn't want to move in case it went. And so he said, I just sat still and enjoyed the moment. I was like, but you could have smiled. Your face said you hated every moment. But see, what did he experience in that moment? He experienced men gathered together, loving each other, enjoying company, being community. He experienced true love. I believe he may have even experienced the presence of God as the people of God gathered to do something which is called enjoying each other. Not even the Champions League was so secondary in that moment. It was brothers dwelling together in unity. When we get community right, it begins to be transformational. When we get community right, when we love each other as we should, we can, I believe, begin to see change. Why? Because I think community, true community, reflects the very heart of God. Communities made from this recipe of Romans chapter 12 are beautiful. They taste like the kingdom. And when people encounter it, they taste and see that God is good. These communities exist to reconcile and redeem and restore. Jesus calls us to be family makers, community creators, communities that have the very heart of God at their center and they taste heavenly and people are drawn to the goodness of God. True community reveals God in his essence. They display the values of the eternal family. Our communities should point to heaven. But how can we call ourselves Christians if we struggle to be the place of welcome? If we can't work out what Romans chapter 12 looks like, if we can't love sincerely, if we are always forsaking what is good and we're not devoted to anybody but ourselves, if these aren't the places where others are honoured because we're always trying to elevate ourselves to the place of honour, if we become apathetic, if we're not passionately serving those around us, if we're not known as people of hope or joyful hope, if we don't know how to share and be hospitable, if we seek revenge and don't know how to bless or live in harmony, what are we building? I started off with a story about my neighbour Paul, who stole everything from us. Let me finish his story. See, Paul's health was declining at such an alarming rate that it seemed like he was ever increasingly in hospital than at home. And I remember the day when an ambulance was called because Paul was really, really sick. He went into hospital and he was told that unless they could find him a liver within the next day or two, that he would pass away. Who went to visit Paul on his deathbed? No drug associates. Not even his family. The only people that went to visit Paul on his deathbed were the boys who lived next door, from whom he'd stolen anything he could carry. And on his deathbed, again, we told him of Christ Jesus, the one who would welcome him, the one who would forgive him, and the one who would be waiting for him. And Paul said, I know. How did he know? Because next door were those people who were living and trying to make Christ known, who had welcomed him in to their houses and to their life, who'd offered him forgiveness and a chance for restoration, and who had done it in the name of Jesus. Sadly, Paul passed away within 24 hours, but I believe I'll see him again. There is hope of change. We've been given an incredible thing. We are made in the image of God in community. Community, I believe, is part of the solution with how we see a change come to broken lives and broken communities. Feel free to critique that as we move to a time of questions. Thanks for listening.
Sam, thank you so much. Truly inspiring. And I haven't got any penny sweets, but I have got a mint. If you would like a mint, at least, help yourself to that. We are open for questions, comments you would like to make. We have a roving mic, I think. Thank you.
Most of our churches are middle class and have their own middle class culture. And at best, some of our churches are doing some nice projects to the poor. But we really want to see that community that is diverse. You've got any tips or advice for us?
I think the key thing for me has always been around making poverty personal. Often we expect people to come to us if they need help. But it's essential that the church leaves the place of comfort and becomes uncomfortable, distressed if necessary, in order to meet the needs of those who are most broken. I think often about justice issues and think, if people truly experienced it, they'd want to do something about it. And so if you're cut up by a driver as you're headed out somewhere, and you feel injustice because they put your life at risk, or they're ahead of you in the queue, you feel the need to do something about it. And I feel like this with the church. The church needs to understand poverty better. You know, I can't remember who it is. I think it's Gustavo Gutierrez that says, you say you love the poor, but what are their names? I think this is the trouble with the church, particularly in our nation, which finds itself increasingly affluent, is that it says it loves the poor, but it doesn't know their name. It's not exposed to them. And I think it's starting at the point of exposure and creating genuine relationships Rather than putting on programs and activities that might attract people in, we need to leave the place of comfort, be willing to be uncomfortable in order to know and fully understand. It's only in relationships that we can understand the complexity of poverty. Often we simplify poverty down to single form. People are hungry, we must feed them, let's create a food bank. Without realizing that the complexity of poverty that those who are presenting as hungry are experiencing are far and wide. They are likely to have experienced some form of trauma. They are likely to have poor healthcare in some area. They might need some educational assistance. There's all this sort of complexity matched together, which we think we can address with a single form or activity. It starts in relationship. And how about we allow those that we're seeking to serve to try and identify the kind of support and help that they would need? How do we help them to help shape what we are seeking to provide? Often we're so far distanced, again, that we think we've got an idea of what might make a difference, but yet we're not connected to those who really are experiencing poverty. And I feel like for us, that's been a key thing. I mean, you know, some people often ask me, how do you bring up a family in this environment? I moved into an estate when I was a single man, aged 20, and I still live in the same neighbourhood 24 years later. Again, long-term investment is key as well, not short-term projects. That's worth identifying there. But people say, well, what are you doing bringing up your children in an area like this? My children are adopted for one reason or another. I could go into more. But the adoption service said, we can't really place kids with you because the kids that we would want to place with you live in your neighbourhood, and it's going to be a bit of a faff, and maybe you could move somewhere nicer to better support them. But we've chosen to bring our children up in the neighbourhood to the point where we'll even put our kids in a school which is really quite a rubbish school. Why would I put my children's education at risk? Well, when we were deciding where to place our children, because they're adopted, they would get, they could choose any school in the city. They get primary choice. So why would I put them in a school that was failing Ofsted? We felt that if the school wasn't good for my children, it's not good enough for any child. And so we decided that if we were going to make a difference to education in our area, we needed to make it personal. Was I really going to be able to give up time? I used to go and sit in early years, and because there was no male teachers in the school, I just would be covered in children that I would be trying to build things with, because I wanted to make a difference in that school. If my children were going to be educated, I needed to make poverty personal, the issues of education personal, in order to do something about it, which is why we filled the sort of local governing board full of people willing to make a difference in community, which is why we removed the head and brought in a super head, which is why we saw the school journey its way out of being a difficult place to being a better place. I've gone down that one heck of a cul-de-sac out here, haven't I? The idea is make poverty personal. The church needs to do that. Sorry, Bishop, I kept talking.
That's what you're here for. So, thank you. Make poverty personal. I love that. And particularly within a context that I'm aware of where government deals in statistics around all of this. Yeah, what a vision that should be personal in that way. Thank you. Other questions? Okay, at the front here.
Sam, a very moving and inspiring talk you've given us, but where in this is there room for political activism? I know we have to make poverty personal, but trying to help people and having people help you also depends upon what laws, if you like, are there. If you restrict child benefit to the first two children, you can almost hear the Scrooge-like, we mustn't encourage the poor to over-reproduce. Where is the place of political activism?
That's a brilliant question. You know what, I find it hard because I don't necessarily think it's my gifting. I think my role would be to probably educate those who are in the process of political activism. I think what you see throughout the ages is people of faith who are brilliant at bringing political change. I think about abolitionists. I think about the formation of the youth service or the formation of NHS. These are all created by people who wanted to seek change at the highest level. I think that therefore means we need partnership. It needs people who are willing to be at the grass level and be exposed if necessary to brokenness and see the impact of poverty, know it firsthand and begin to use their weight. What's interesting is one of our teams lived in, what was it called? Lived at the bottom of Grenfell Tower. We had a team that existed in London, serving that community before it burnt down. In fact, they woke to see Grenfell Tower on fire. They became very politically active early on, but what they didn't want to do was take the voice of the poor and be that voice for them. They wanted to initially use their resources, use their skills in order to give voice to the voiceless. Again, what I don't want to do is to fall into the trap of assuming that I know and that I can take the voice on. How do I enable those from my community, those with first-hand grassroots experience, lived experience of poverty, and give voice to the voiceless? That, for me, I think would be my key thing. And therefore, how can I engage them, even in local politics? What's beautiful is we're a very Labour area, my area, that is unlikely to change anytime soon. But my local councillor for years has been someone disconnected from the community, but just a Labour stalwart. What's beautiful is that I've seen this couple take on this local role, and they have now become our councillors, voted in, who are born and raised in the community, have experienced poverty, but yet have been helped and assisted to take the voice. I wouldn't want to necessarily get into political activism for me. I really found it difficult, when that statistic around child poverty came, the BBC came, and they wanted me to slate local government because they'd clearly failed my neighbourhood. And actually what was difficult was a local politician came and said, if you get involved in this, we will end you. There was a political threat, even from the Labour Party, that they would end our work if we engaged in any kind of making this issue political. And that was a real concern. I didn't want to put the work that we were doing at jeopardy, but yet I wanted to make sure the voice of those who were experiencing poverty had volume. And I think that's what we've attempted to do as a team, raise up local voices rather than try to be a voice for them.
If I can just add to that, if I may.
Please do. Help.
Using the position, if you like, of chairing. But, the particular issue that you mentioned in terms of the two-child limit and on benefits, I would want to say, and I realise I have to tread carefully, we're in an election period, but I think there is a moment of opportunity, that within both the main political parties, there is talk about trying to change that. I think it is a moment, once we know who our new MPs are, to be writing to them and to be saying, actually, this needs to be changed. It is the clearest evidence that we have that it will lift people out of poverty in terms of economic impact, in particular, of any policy that we know of. So, I just, if you like, adding that's the both and, isn't it? I think the sense of you're giving very much of the personal embeddedness and absolutely enabling people from particular communities to be able to speak for themselves. But I think for those of us who do have access into other places, if you like, then there is a place for challenging particular policies and doing that forcefully without a sort of political allegiance necessarily. It is about the policy itself. Yep.
As a leader, as someone who has a voice, I have to make sure I use that properly. What was interesting is I recently was invited by the shadow member for communities who is preparing for government, and she'd drawn a bunch of Christian charities and people of faith to almost say, how can we better work on this together? A woman who, is seeing herself removed from the front line, but wants to be able to make policies that will bring change. And I love the fact that she was seeking advice from people like me, but I don't want to stand in the way of those who should have a voice into that.
Thank you. Other questions?
Thank you very much. You've spoken very movingly from a very strong Christian ethos, and particularly your story about how you brought Paul to an understanding of what might be on the other side. how do you build engagement with people in your community who have a faith different from your own? What pointers do you have?
Very good. I think those values that you see from St. Paul there would be easily transferable. My neighbourhood is fascinating in that when I first moved in, it was 99% white. It's now known as Little Nigeria. We've seen the population change significantly. And with that, a real increase in not just racial diversity, but also faith diversity. You know, now on my street for the first time, I have Muslim families, and my son actually is now in a school where he's a minority. He's one of only 4 white children in his class, and his best friends are all Muslims. I believe those values around cherishing, honouring, celebrating are actually really transferable. And regardless of religion, we should be making sure that we are sharing those and trying to live those out. My job in that instance is not to try and change a Muslim and turn them into a Christian. My job is to represent my faith, represent Christ, who I think epitomises those values, and make him known. But at the same time, I think those values are one that are cohesive and create community. I talk about community. How do you form better community? Well, culture is key. If you want to see communities formed, create culture. And so for me, in the park that's near my house, we were the first people to get a Christmas tree and create a Christmas celebration that welcomed loads of people as we turned the lights on. And it's created culture. But yet there are other cultures that are increasingly making my community a more beautiful place. Whether that's the lady who yesterday in our park did a colour run, which had no faith at all, but yet welcomed 400 residents in celebration of her son, who was killed very tragically in our community. But yet that is a culture creator, which forms community well. Christians have great culture that can bring and add to communities, but we shouldn't think that we're the only people who can create culture with our faith. And how do we therefore honour those with different faiths and different cultures and see their value within our community? They too can be transformational, I believe.
Thank you. Great. We've got time for a couple more questions. Oops. Over here.
I don't think that there is any sense that anyone would question not only the common sense of this, but also the belief and the success that is due. But it's one of these things that seems to be in pockets. You talk about the communities, and you have, your organisation appears to have a number of these around the country. To your knowledge, is there anywhere, especially in essence, is there a country in the world that has got this right?
Wow. I wish I knew the geopolitical sphere a bit better. I mean, it would only be anecdotal in, you know, that kind of African proverb around it taking a village to raise a child. I think I love the way, actually, you know, there is sometimes the best community formed in the most broken places. And I think there is this interdependence. You know, when I talk about why young men join gangs or why drug addicts gather together, I think there's a sense in which by nature, brokenness makes us more dependent on one another. I would find it really difficult to have a ministry to the affluent that are hidden in detached houses behind high fences. I love the fact that on a summer's day, my neighbours bring their sofas out onto the street because we don't really have gardens, where our lives are intertwined because we hear each other through the wall. And so I think sometimes we aspire to a type of community that looks like the village fete and the maypole. But actually, I think true, genuine community can be found in the most broken places. So my first thought was, think about somewhere that's fixed. It's probably going to be Norway, or it's going to be Sweden, or somewhere like that. I think you actually might find a real interdependence that is found actually in some of the most broken places. But would it be somewhere that the West would deem desirable? Probably not. But the most desirable thing for me is community, to be known and to know, to be loved and to love. So I suppose it's all around what you value most highly. But if we're talking about societal change and transformation, that for me is very, very difficult to articulate, because I'm not sure it necessarily multiplies up. How big can a community be? Actually, it probably is very, very narrow in some regards. Who can I invest in? Who can I really know well? Can I really know more than a dozen people deeply? I think we've got to be careful that we don't try and create this model that can be replicated and rolled out. It's very, very difficult in that regard. I've answered your question poorly. I apologise. Maybe the bishop can tell us which country it actually is. The flag will appear behind me.
There we go. Absolutely. I'm going to follow up with another question, though, if I may, just to press you a little bit further on that, I suppose, because you talked about the inverse care law, which I think was specifically sort of developed around healthcare, but it can apply in lots of different areas, I think. And the example you've just given, I suppose, particularly around potentially African communities and so on. Is there something about economically poorer communities knowing more about what it means to be genuinely in community, or is that too simplistic?
I mean, I only know it from my first-hand experience. What I've experienced of community in my own neighbourhood. A neighbourhood that when I moved into was in the top 10 most deprived neighbourhoods out of 32,000 different neighbourhoods in the UK. An area really deeply blighted by community, but yet a community that was very quick to welcome. And some of the most beautiful provision given to me by some of the poorest people that I've ever met. I used to do this project, I called it Saturday Club, where I took young lads from my community that all had no dads. 2 of them were twins. Their dad had hung himself the day I moved to the community, actually. And I used to take them, these 2 lads and a couple of others, and I didn't have children of my own, so I used to use my Saturdays to take them out. And I remember one lad called Brian who mum's schizophrenic dad disappeared when he was a little boy, living in such abject poverty that the roof of his house had collapsed in. They lived downstairs because effectively the roof had fallen in. But his mum, whenever I would visit and pick up Brian, would wait for me with a gift. And they weren't gifts that I ever wanted. One of them was like this Wedgwood plate. One of them was a shirt, which was like a pirate shirt and did up with a rope. But her generosity was absolutely incredible. Her desire to provide for me as I provided for her, this mutually existing relationship. She really wanted me to need her, and I really wanted to be needed. And actually, that's really interesting for me is I came in thinking I had something to offer, but actually what I found was a community that wanted to give. And I've really had to do this thing where I'm not the cavalry, and I needed to sort of level the scales up. And actually, I talked about my kids being adopted. My best mate, Steve, I remember the day I went to see him and said, he saw my countenance was sad and broken, and I just found out that I couldn't have children. And Steve said, I'm going to journey with you through the process of adoption, and I will one day be your children's uncle. And he said, in my family, the uncle buys the first pet. And that's what he knew his role would be. Well, I didn't want a pet bought by Steve because he had this dog which was half pit bull, half wolf. And his dog was called Havoc, right? And I'm scared witless of dogs. And so his Uncle Steve offering to buy me a pet, thankfully we got 2 rabbits, which was lovely. But this was a guy who I'd gone to serve, and yet he was serving me and became a beautiful support. And so it isn't that we're friends because actually I continue to pour into him. We're friends because he knows me and he loves me and he continues to pour into my life. And that's what true community looks like. And we've got to be careful that when we try to create community, it doesn't become, well, what can we all give into the mix to make it better? Actually, what can we find value in? You know, within community transformation, we call it the ABC, you know, asset-based community development. How do we find the assets of the community and help them to be cohesive and work together for the common good? I'm not the one with the answers. The answers lie within how can I draw them out? And actually finding those within areas of deprivation maybe isn't as hard as we think it is. The values are beautiful and wonderful and ready to be given more freely. And actually what we don't think is that the poorest in our nation have anything to contribute. We are sadly mistaken.
Really, really helpful. And so much of that just resonates with me. I asked the question partly because of my own experience of having worked in Africa and reflected a lot on the whole idea of gift exchange and the idea that actually gifts come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. It's just that in the West, we have come to so value commodities, money and things, over other forms of gift. And that whole idea of actually exploring different gifts. I shall remember the role of the uncle to buy the first pet. That's a beautiful example. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Nishan as Vice-Chancellor, who is going to give a final word of thanks.
How do I follow that? As Bishop Martin said, I'm Nishan Kanagraja, I'm the Vice-Chancellor, so it's a real pleasure to say a few words to you as a way of closing. First of all, Sam, what an inspiring talk. Thank you very much for challenging us. Very thought-provoking, but inspiring what you've done in your own life and how you're setting an example for many of us to think and follow and see how we can make a difference in our communities. And for many of you who don't know me well enough, I come from a very poor part of Sri Lanka, and I have seen firsthand what poverty does to communities. And I have been fortunate enough to be part of communities doing what I can to refugee communities in Sri Lanka who were displaced with absolutely nothing, have to rebuild their life from scratch. And it is very hard, but as you correctly said at the end, I fully agree with you. When you engage in these activities, what you get is more than what you put in. And you never expect that as the end result. And I certainly think that is a lesson for us all. And it is not just about monetary, it's about our time and our energy and making connections and opening doors for people. So I think it's fantastic to have you here talk about community and poverty. But I think there's something that I want to kind of say that kind of keeps me worried as well, is that increasingly in the modern society, even the notion of community is being questioned. We live in virtual worlds. We live in social worlds. What is the community? But I personally believe the physical, the interpersonal relationships, that community will never go away. The best example I can give you is during COVID. It was challenging for us. We all had to struggle to adjust to being individuals in our own right without a community. That was the hardest part of the COVID, not the disease itself. And I think we all know the social implications of that. So thank you very much for giving up your time and giving us some things to think about. Bishop Martin, thank you very much for sponsoring this and organizing this event. And we have this annual event. And as you said, we want to do this in partnership with other universities. And for those of you who don't know much about the three universities, just to kind of finish off on the note of community, the three universities feel we need to work together more and more because there is no point in duplicating or competing when there could be more impact by working together. And the three vice-chancellors, we work well together. And we've created this partnership called University Partnership. Wherever we can, we share knowledge, we share resource, we share expertise for the common good. So I'm really pleased that we are doing that. And this is an example of how this is also now going to be shared with other universities, this lecture series. Finally, Luke, for you, for what you do in the university in terms of the chaplaincy and for also organizing this event and all making sure that it all goes well. thank you very much for coming. I'm sure Luke is going to say a few more words. On behalf of the university, it's a real pleasure to have you, Sam, and have this event. And thank you all very much for coming as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nishan. Well, that's it for this evening. We're going to hold Nishan and Bishop Martin and Sam just for a quick photo. But for everyone else, thank you so much for being here. I hope you leave appropriately challenged, but also inspired. There are some refreshments out there where you came in, which are a part of this free event. So do enjoy those and continue to chat. Sam will be around for a little bit. You'll have a chance to speak to him once we've had him for a quick photo as well. So thanks everyone for being here, and enjoy the rest of your evening and the rest of your week.